and welcome to APTN National News Weekend. I'm Daryl Stranger. We begin in Montreal, where for the first time in its 20-year history, the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, a much-needed space for the urban Indigenous community, was forced to close its doors when most of its staff contracted COVID-19. But with needs greater than ever, the question remains, what happens next? Lindsay Richardson reports.
This is the fabulous social workers telling me about.
The Native Women's Shelter of Montreal thought they prepared for the worst.
We have these kinds of masks.
Until the worst happened.
It was really unbelievable. I never thought I would see the day that I would have to close. You can see there's already a stack of food.
The shelter, a safe space for Indigenous women across the city, forced to close its doors for the first time after most of its staff tested positive for COVID-19.
It was hard. It was really difficult because I never intended to close the shelter.
They had a plan. Divide staff into 2 groups and rotate them if necessary. 5 people in Group 1 became infected, and the virus quickly hit Group 2.
We were running out of staff.
And also running out of options. The shelter opted to close. Clients were moved to another location, quick to get on board with the plan.
And I was expecting them to be really resistant, but they were scared. They were scared to see one staff after another get sick. They were scared that they were going to potentially get it. They were scared of what was going to happen.
Despite the provincial government's confidence, a network of Indigenous groups across Montreal called on Quebec authorities to pause deconfinement and prioritize on-site and unpoliced testing for the homeless. Getting women to testing sites is challenging. Nakaset asked repeatedly for a mobile clinic to come and swab all the shelter's clients, with or without symptoms, but it never happened.
If people are asymptomatic and they're sharing a drink or sharing a cigarette or whatever, it's going to blow up.
Last week, the federal government announced more assistance for urban Indigenous communities to fight COVID-19. But the promise of a second wave is causing strain across Quebec. Maison Missanak, a women's shelter near Quebec City, created a quarantine unit out of empty rooms when one staffer tested positive. But they're worried demand and infection rates will spike during deconfinement, while support plans remain the same.
Là, présentement, je dirais que c'est comme un silence. Puis moi, et pas rien que moi, il y a des femmes ici, des maisons, ont peur parce que le silence qui est là présentement, quand il y aura le déconfinement, on a peur aussi que là, tu sais, tout arrive en même temps. Puis que...
Montreal is still the epicenter of the virus in Canada. While businesses have opened with restrictions, shelters have not. But Premier François Legault says more tests are coming.
Ta-da! Here's a population that hasn't been tested. This will get your numbers up, and this could also help to stop the spread. Just sort of the common room where everyone kind of sat down.
With so much on the line, Nakaset says shelters and the clients they serve don't need any more mixed messages. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
Many people in Vancouver are alarmed to see an increase in violence since the pandemic started. As Tina House reports, it's everything from hate crimes to unprovoked attacks, and some residents fear it's getting more dangerous.
According to Vancouver Police Deputy Chief Howard Chow, Vancouver has seen an increase in violence during the pandemic.
So far in 2020, the VPD has identified 77 hate-associated police files. This is up from 51 for the same time in 2019. And this increase is driven largely by an increase in anti-Asian incidents.
In this video released by police, it shows a man walking up to a young Asian woman on Granville Street and punching her in the face. This other video shows another man grabbing this elderly Chinese man and throwing him out of a convenience store. Suspects were identified in those cases. More recently, the famous lion statue that marked the entrance to Vancouver's Chinatown were defaced with graffiti that blames COVID-19 on Chinese people. And this video shows the bruised face of a 27-year-old Indigenous woman who was punched twice after being mistaken for an Asian while she was out walking her dog. Officials say crimes like these has been fueled by COVID-19.
Hate is insidious. Right now, it's anti-Asian, but it spreads like a virus and impacts us all.
And with the recent dismantling of Tent City and Oppenheimer Park, BC Housing has moved many of those people to hotels near the Granville Strip. Area residents say there's been an increase in open drug use, violence, and garbage in parks like this one.
We've noticed it's been increasingly more dangerous.
One time my daughter was actually picked up a needle and she was playing on it, playing with it. So I was like, oh my God, I was freaking out.
Christian Weiss agrees. He's been homeless for a few months on Vancouver's downtown east side, and he says he's also noticed a difference since COVID-19.
Sometimes there's people that get a little bit their minds get, a little bit warped on the various drugs that they're taking. So yeah, there'll be sometimes guys will be freaking out, waving weapons around and whatnot, and it's you got to do what you can to keep them calm and make sure you don't get yourself hurt.
Lorelei Williams also lives near downtown Vancouver. She says she has encountered more and more violent people in her neighborhood since the pandemic began.
There's definitely been a high rise in violence in my neighborhood. And I mean, just the other night I was walking my dog and I was walking her and this guy was coming at me. He was coming towards me. He was being very aggressive, being very loud. And just as I was going to turn the other way, I noticed he went in the other direction. So I turned around and I watched him, and he was just hitting all the cars with objects with his hands. He was being aggressive with the people that he was walking by, and he was hitting all the windows on the businesses. He ended up getting chased by some men. But in that moment, I did call the police.
Dr. Jane Buxton from the BC Centre for Disease Control says that in the month of April, there are 113 overdoses, and she says COVID-19 has created more complications for people dealing with addictions.
People may be getting more anxious, the drugs may be more toxic, so people are getting more concerned. We've seen more overdoses. We had a highest number of overdoses responded to by the ambulance service at the last check issuance week than we'd seen for a couple of years. So there's a combination of things that are happening.
Robert Bonner also lives in the downtown east side. He says people are becoming more erratic and frustrated the longer this pandemic lasts.
Yeah, I think more people are arming themselves with stuff, and there's just doesn't seem to be that cohesiveness amongst the people. Like everybody is, like they've got what I call hungry eyes. Everybody's got it. You just walk down the street and everybody you see it in their eyes. They're hungry because they can't get help with addictions. There's not enough food. There's no place for them to stay. They hear everybody say, "We self-isolate." Well, where are these people supposed to go?
I think to stay safe, definitely go out before dark. Go out with somebody if you can. Have a family member or a friend walk with you. Call the police if you see anything suspicious. The police can't do anything, or they can't catch anybody if nobody calls them.
Vancouver police say they are continuing to increase patrols, but are warning citizens to be aware. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
We want to hear what you think. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptn news. Also, you can follow APTN News on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more Indigenous news. The Crown will not be appealing the acquittal of a man who was charged in the 2018 hit-and-run death of a Mi'kmaq youth in New Brunswick. 22-year-old Brady Francis died after he was struck on the side of a road in February of 2018. Maurice Johnson was charged for the hit-and-run, but maintained that he thought he hit a deer. Last month, Johnson was acquitted in a Moncton courthouse, sparking outrage in Mi'kmaq communities. The Director of Public Prosecution said in a news release today that there was no indication of racial bias in the acquittal and that the judge made no errors in the decision. A Wet'suwet'en woman suing a Smithers RCMP officer was awarded a settlement last week. A judge ruled she was falsely arrested and the use of force was excessive. Lee Wilson has the details.
In 2014, Irene Joseph was taken to the ground and handcuffed by RCMP Constable Darren Meyer in Smithers, British Columbia. She was 61 years old at the time and used a walker for mobility. According to court documents, Meyer was responding to a call from a local store manager about a suspected shoplifter. Joseph told the officer she did nothing wrong before being swept to the ground. Her belongings were searched outside the store, but no stolen items were found. She sued Constable Meyer and Attorney General of Canada as a result of the incident. Last Friday, a BC Supreme Court judge awarded Joseph $55,000 in damages, and agreeing that Joseph was falsely arrested and the force used to subdue her was excessive. Joseph could not be reached for a comment on this story. Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Kitimat.
Canada's Ombudsman for Victims of Crime recently made her first visit to the Northern Territories. She asked for knowledge from Indigenous frontline workers. As Charlotte Moritz-Jacobs reports, they've included a Northern voice in this new move.
Jaylene Buggins has experienced gaps in the territorial justice system firsthand.
So I went through a jury trial as a victim of a sexual assault. And there was a juror sitting in there that sat there, and he was like, 3 hours in. They stopped the trial and asked him, like, are you okay? He's like, yeah, I'm just bored. He was just bored.
This year, she was asked to sit on the first Indigenous Advisory Circle working with the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime, a watchdog organization geared towards holding the federal government accountable to meeting its responsibilities for victims of crime. Their presence isn't well known in the territories yet, something they're hoping to change.
But after I met with Heidi in March and we had lunch and I got to talk to her a little more and actually share part of my story, struggles that I had growing up, being in and out of the justice system, and young offenders, constantly in trouble with the law, injustices I've even faced.
Federal Ombudsman Heidi Illingworth met with frontline workers like Buggins for the first time in Yellowknife back in March before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. They documented challenges they heard to bring forward to the federal justice minister.
With not enough staff, like the victim services here, there's a program coordinator and one worker. So for the city, that's 20,000, that's pretty big population, and so they have a lot of burden on them.
Buggins says the territorial courts tend to favor the perpetrators, and a lot of them don't take responsibility for their actions.
And I'm going to use sexual assault in court cases as an example. After that first time, you're in court and you're sitting there and you're crying, you're like, I did it wrong, I'm sorry, I did something wrong. And you're apologizing and you're about to be punished and you're sitting there and you're crying. You know you did something wrong. But when you go and you do it again, and then they continue to be like, okay, yeah, release on your own recognizance, and then you go and do it again, and you get a short sentence, then you're released, and then you go and do it again, and it's like finally like 5-6 times later, and they're like, hey, you're gonna do like 3 years in jail.
This has been raised with the federal ombudsman. But there's something else. Convicted perpetrators are sometimes given 2 years less a day sentences for crimes that would get penitentiary time if they were committed in the South. The reason? No federal prisons in the North, and the system does not want to send offenders far away from cultural supports and family in the NWT.
That's an interesting and difficult challenge as well for the justice system up here in this context, is what do you do with the perpetrators and how do you ensure that, you know, we're addressing the most serious violent crime, and maybe we can divert some of the other crimes out of the justice system more effectively, but at the same time prioritizing victim safety.
With half of the population of the NWT being Indigenous, and it being less than a week away from the anniversary of the MMIWG Calls for Justice, Buggins says her immediate priority will be to push the federal ombudsman to look into which Northern-specific recommendations have not yet been fulfilled. She'll meet again with the Indigenous Advisory Circle this July. Charlotte Moritz-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
It's time for a short break, but still to come, how Indigenous entrepreneurs are using the pandemic to explore new business ventures. Stay with us. Welcome back. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced Indigenous businesses across the country to close their doors, while others have gotten creative with new opportunities. As Brittany Hobson shows us, a handful of Indigenous entrepreneurs are using the pandemic to explore new business ventures.
When COVID-19 hit, Josh Giesbrecht was working in the hemp industry. It was connections within this business that prompted a new venture. In April, Giesbrecht began looking into distributing personal protective equipment, or PPE.
So what you're seeing is an industry that went from a very niche boutique industry, dealing with medical folk, to overnight to the whole public across the whole globe.
Giesbrecht and a group of partners formed Exchange PPE, a 100% Indigenous-owned company, with the goal of supplying PPE to other businesses and Indigenous communities. While the company is not solely focusing on the latter, Giesbrecht said it was important to include a branch that works exclusively with communities because some have been hit hard during the pandemic, including the Navajo Nation in the United States.
What I saw, unfortunately, the situation down there, and especially once the infection rate got higher than New York City, it became apparent that, okay, we need to prepare now so that way we're not caught flat-footed, and at least offer that service.
This fogging machine is one of the products the team is working to get into communities. It uses an alcohol-free solution to sanitize, which they say is a safe and effective option to use against the virus. Part of their services include training people in the community on how to use the machine. Kyra Wilson is a community advisor with the company. She has been in contact with First Nations in Manitoba.
We are trying to focus on some of those unique needs and really work with First Nations communities on what those needs are.
Wilson says it's important to offer safe solutions during this time.
There is that conversation that's happening right now about a second wave. So right now what we're saying is, just be prepared if you're not already, and let us help you, be proactive in keeping your community safe.
As case numbers fluctuate and places begin to reopen, Giesbrecht notes the irony of starting a new business during an uncertain time.
Do I see it being sustainable in the long run? I hope not, to be honest, because I think we all want to return back to what we had, some semblance of it. But, the future is long. And what we've heard from the health experts is that there could be other pandemics that come after this. And so at least we'll have the knowledge to be ready for the next one.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Some museums across the country are planning for future exhibits and calling on anyone who wants to share their experience during the pandemic, whether that be through written letters or artifacts. Tamara Pimentel explains.
During this time of grief and uncertainty, everyone has a story to tell. COVID-19 has affected everyone differently, and that might be finding an alternative for traditional gatherings or using that extra time to get creative. These are the stories that museums across the country want you to tell for future generations.
We're having a unique experience in the world in the sense that everyone in the world is passing through this experience at the same time. But we recognize that not everyone is experiencing it in the same way.
Jenny Conway-Fisher from the Glenbow Museum in Calgary says curators are collecting stories that matter to the public by taking submissions of written letters that tell different experiences. Fisher says an exhibit wouldn't be complete without Indigenous voices.
The Glenbow holds so many objects and belongings and things that are important to our Indigenous partners that it's important to pair those things with contemporary voices.
At the Royal Alberta Museum in Edmonton, Director of Cultural Studies Alison Perry says they want to tell stories of the pandemic through artifacts.
I hope at some point we can talk to people about what we can do in a museum setting that might showcase some of these initiatives that are community grown.
Many Indigenous people took to social media to showcase traditional dance and music. And then there are groups like Breathe, an outlet for Indigenous artists to express their art through masks. The group is also working with galleries across Canada and the U.S. for future displays. But there is more than artwork that is being shared.
Online, I think it's amazing what's been going on in terms of language revitalization, land-based learning, like some communities are going back, taking their youth back out on the land, using the language as they're gathering, and to find those sort of nuggets of beauty I think that's probably what's getting a lot of us through.
Perry says the Royal Alberta Museum will connect with Indigenous nations at a less stressful time and when communities are no longer on lockdown. As for the Glenbow, Fisher says submissions will be accepted until July 31st. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
It's time for one more break, but stick around. 2020 has been a big year for Indigenous nominees at the Canadian Screen Awards. We'll show you some of the winners from this past year. Welcome back. 2020 has been a big year for Indigenous nominees at the Canadian Screen Awards. Online ceremonies began Monday night with some big wins for Indigenous women. Elena McDougall has more.
This film took a lot of commitment and courage from them, and it wasn't easy at any step of the way. And so I feel really good that that's been recognized as well.
We Will Stand Up is about Colton Bushy, the young man from the Red Pheasant First Nation in Saskatchewan who was shot and killed by a farmer. The farmer was found not guilty of second-degree murder. Filmmaker Tasha Hubbard directed it. She won the Ted Rogers Best Feature-Length Documentary Award for her work at this year's Canadian Screen Awards.
It's a mixed feeling, and you know, I'll truly, you know, celebrate when we see those changes being made.
2020 has been an impressive year for Indigenous content at the Canadian Screen Awards. APTN National News had nominations in the Best National Anchor and Best Newscast categories. APTN Investigates was nominated for Best News or Information Series and Best Photography. In Focus was also nominated for Best Talkback. The network had 4 nominations in programming, 1 for First Contact and 3 for Future History.
Jennifer Podesta. Oh my God, babe! What? It's me! Yeah.
Actor and director Jennifer Podesta won Best Direction for Future History.
I really believe that this award reminds us that we can all celebrate together as a collective and say, we need more of these stories. You know, not just specifically in a show like Future History, but more content like that. I really do believe that our stories contribute to the wellness of society. They really do. They make us fuller and healthier and happier and create stronger relationships and definitely build tolerance and understanding.
APTN congratulates all of the award winners. Elena McDougall, APTN National News, Hamilton.
That's been your look at this edition of APTN National News Weekend. Be sure to check out our website, aptnnews.ca, for all your Indigenous news. I'm Gerald Stranger. Thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend.